It's official. Atlas does not fit the commentary mold. Everyone pay attention. Scientific confirmation. Recent observations and measurements converge toward a clear and unsettling conclusion. Atlas is not a comet. Hubble images, JUICE probe images, spectra, X-ray detections, composition analyses, and amateur ground-based observations form a dossier that dismantles piece by piece the conventional comet hypothesis. This is not speculation. It is a body of evidence that demands immediate reclassification. Let's get straight to the point. If you were expecting more of the same dust, ice, a dense coma, diffused jets, prepare for the opposite. Atlas displays self-generated energy emission, a rigid forward jet, an anomalous metallic composition with excess nickel, unparalleled optical polarization, acceleration that defies pure gravity, and a morphology that resembles manufactured objects. Yes, these are strong words, but science doesn't work with dramatization. It works with evidence, and the evidence now points in the same direction. What's new? Images and data that changed everything. Within a few weeks, we received decisive images and measurements. The JUICE probe captured the object with its navigation camera and scientific instruments during the early November 2025 approach. Hubble reobserved Atlas on November 30, 2025, releasing a post-perihelion image showing a drop-shaped coma and an antitail pointing toward the star at the center of our solar system. Avi Lobo analyzed these images and noted that the antisolar extension perfectly matches the predicted separation of a swarm of objects detaching from the nucleus, a separation on the order of 60,000 km. Meanwhile, ground-based images from observers in Namibia and elsewhere revealed defined jets, including a forward projected jet with distinct coloration. In contrast, some processed versions of the Hubble images show artifacts a square outline near the nucleus in recently published frames, raising questions about image handling. But even discounting processing uncertainties, the general observational pattern is consistent. Atlas does not behave like a classic ice comet. Physical evidence that dismantles the comet hypothesis. Here is the list of physical incompatibilities that render the comet explanation unsustainable when taken together. And each item will be explained in sequence. Self-emitted X-rays, rigid forward jet and antitail pointing toward the star, weak coma and tail, little visible material, anomalous metallic composition, nickel ratio far too high compared to iron, strongly negative optical polarization, non-gravitational acceleration without sufficient visible debris, minimal mass loss incompatible with such extensive jets, rotation signatures and elongation inconsistent with a fractured icy nucleus, repeated orbital coincidences with passes by Mars, Venus, and Jupiter, a sequence of unusual brightness variations and bluish tint, jets columnated over millions of km, energy requirements incompatible with the nucleus's estimated size. First point, X-ray detection at Atlas's position. X-rays are not simply light reflected by the star at the center of our solar system. They represent self-generated energy emission. For a comet to consistently produce X-rays, it would need to expel massive amounts of gas that, when interacting with stellar wind and charged particles, would generate such radiation, the exact opposite of what we see in Atlas, which appears extremely dry and minimally active. Second point, composition. Studies indicate a nickel-to-iron ratio on the order of 10:1 in the observed metallic fraction, something closer to industrial alloys than the composition of a typical comet nucleus, which is dominated by volatiles and refractory grains with very different proportions. This chemical signature alone raises many red flags. Third point, morphology. A well-defined antitail projecting forward with columnated jets and a rigid frontal structure does not fit the model of diffuse volatile material ejection. Natural jets tend to disperse and show similar colors and compositions when originating from the same source. In Atlas, we see jets with differing tones, a sign of heterogeneity that is hard to reconcile with a homogeneous, icy nucleus. Fourth point, non-gravitational acceleration measurements indicate velocity changes not explained by gravity alone. In comet models, non-gravitational accelerations arise from volatile sublimation, creating thrust, but this requires mass loss and a visible debris cloud. In Atlas, we have acceleration without a cloud sufficient to justify the magnitude of change, meaning there's not enough visible mass to explain the effect. Fifth point, the energy involved. Jets this extensive and columnated would require mass fluxes and an absorption area far exceeding what a nucleus the size of Atlas could support if it were just ice. Practically speaking, the amount of material and the ejection velocity observed would require energy sources or propulsion mechanisms that do not align with standard comet physics. The definitive evidence, the sum of the anomalies, important. A single isolated point might have alternative explanations. But when anomalies accumulate X-rays, excess nickel, forward jets, negative polarization, unexplained acceleration, irregular phototitric behavior, and orbital coincidences, the picture changes. The likelihood that all of this can be explained by a combination of ordinary natural causes drops dramatically. It is precisely the convergence of these signals that constitutes scientific confirmation. Conservative scientists who initially dismissed radical hypotheses have begun admitting that the most plausible explanation is no longer simply a comet. This is not opinion, it is a rational response to empirical observations. The mini-probe hypothesis, the scenario that fits the data. Among the proposed hypotheses, one stands out for its ability to reconcile different anomalies. The release of multiple objects, mini-probes, scouts, reflectors from a primary body. Modeling and calculations show that a swarm of non-volatile macroscopic objects released near perihelion could produce exactly the observed anti-solar luminous trail. Numerous reflectors aligned to appear at a distance as a continuous streak. Here's how this matches the data. A set of reflectors produces the anti-tail pointing toward the star at the center of our solar system. Lighter particles and objects respond differently to stellar gravity, explaining the observed non-gravitational acceleration. Many probes and reflectors naturally explain the columnated jets and the color differences between expelled structures. If part of the material consists of a nickel-rich metallic alloy, this explains the unusual spectral signatures. Moreover, this hypothesis generates testable predictions, a fundamental requirement of science. If the anti-tail is associated with the release of many probes, its visibility should vary with the orbital delivery events. Observers modeled that a drastic drop in visibility around December 19, 2025 would match the end of a delivery to Mars, and a resurgence near the Jupiter encounter predicted for March 16, 2026 would reinforce the hypothesis. These are clear observable predictions, science and action. What a lobe contributed to this puzzle. Avib, analyzing the images and preliminary data, presented an interpretation that aligns with the swarm object idea. He highlighted that the drop-shaped coma in post-P perihelion images matches the predicted separation between Atlas and a set of larger fragments. A separation around 60,000 km, exactly the length of the anti-ale in the November 30th, 2025 Hubble observation. Low also pointed to the preliminary JUICE image from November 2nd, 2025, showing a halo and hints of two tails. These images were taken shortly before the probe's closest approach to Atlas and JUICE's instruments promise composition, particle, and spectral data that could confirm or refute the presence of detached macroscopic material. Considering natural alternatives, exomoon, planetary fragment, depleted comet. Before jumping to bold conclusions, let's examine the natural alternatives the scientific community has considered. Exomoon, a moon torn from an exoplanet, theoretically possible, but would require a history that allows survival for billions of years and a mechanism for the observed jet activity. The metallic composition and X-ray emission do not easily align with a typical exomoon, planetary fragment. A chunk of a planet could in principle show high metal content. However, the combination of directed jets, X-ray emission, and non-gravitational acceleration without a visible cloud remains unexplained in this scenario. Extremely weak, depleted comet, the initial favorite. But the near absence of water around 4%, the extreme polarization, the anomalous nickel proportion, and the self-emitted energy make this hypothesis increasingly unlikely. In summary, none of the natural alternatives comfortably explains the full anomaly set. And in science, that is an invitation to consider hypotheses that were previously dismissed without serious analysis. Essential recap: the Atlas anomalies. Before moving forward, it's crucial to establish a complete overview. Here are the 12 central anomalies associated with Atlas. A set so consistent that taken together, it simply does not fit the category of a natural comet. A retrograde trajectory aligned with the ecliptic plane, statistically improbable for an interstellar object which would normally display chaotic dispersed angles. Jets oriented directly toward the star at the center of our solar system, producing an anti-tail whose geometry cannot be resolved by perspective alone. An apparent mass incompatible with the history of interstellar visitors, suggesting a body more compact and dense than a cometary nucleus should be. A sequence of successive approaches to Mars, Venus, and Jupiter. An orbital chain extremely unlikely without some additional factor influencing the path. An anomalous nickel, rich plume with concentrations far exceeding those observed in traditional comets. Gas emissions with extremely little water, only about 4% completely at odds with typical comet composition. Intensely negative optical polarization with rare phototric behavior, difficult to fit into the catalog of known natural objects. An apparent origin in the same region associated with the famous WOW signal, a coincidence unsettling even to those who reject unconventional explanations. A sudden brightness increase accompanied by an unusual bluish tint, stronger than the reference star used in the observations. Jets requiring a solar absorption area far larger than the estimated nucleus size, exposing a deep energy imbalance. A non-gravitational acceleration that would imply losing around 13% of its mass without any visible cloud to justify such material ejection. Surprisingly, columnated jets remaining stable for millions of kilom without distortions expected from an irregular rotating nucleus. To summarize clearly and directly, the scientific evidence available today forms a robust argument that Atlas is not a comet in the classical sense. The combination of X-ray emission, anomalous metallic composition, forward anti-tail, non-gravitational acceleration, and morphological patterns is not compatible with conventional comet models. This does not solve everything, far from it, but science does not demand absolute certainty. It demands coherence between theory and observation. And right now, coherence favors the re-evaluation of Atlas's nature and the investigation of alternative hypotheses, including the possibility of non-volatile material and ejected structures that might have technological function. The best approach now is scientific and cautious. Observe, measure, and compare with predictions. The mini-probe hypothesis provides clear predictions for upcoming orbital passes. If the observations match, we will have a qualitative leap in understanding. What do you think of this evidence? Do the readings I presented seem convincing enough to treat Atlas as something beyond a comet? Leave your theory in the comments, share the video, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. Comment and share to keep this investigation alive. Let's follow the next juice data releases in Hubble analyzes, because the Atlas story is only beginning, and the upcoming observations may definitively confirm Atlas is not a comet.